I just want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Amy Catania. I'm the Executive Director at Historic Saranac Lake at the Saranac Laboratory Museum. I see many familiar names here on the screen, and many of you have had a chance to visit the museum. We are reopened to the public now. We have a new exhibit opening up next month, so if you haven't had a chance to stop by, I hope you'll see us soon. We operate the Saranac Laboratory Museum in downtown Saranac Lake, and we are in the middle of a museum expansion project to another historic building next door, the Trudeau Building. And that expansion really allows us to tell a much broader story of the Saranac Lake region. So it has really inspired us to start to think more about the history, many of the different stories of the area beyond tuberculosis, and into the past before Dr. Trudeau ever came to the Adirondacks. So we're really excited to be holding this speaker series. This is the first of 3 talks that we're hosting on the anniversary of the founding of the APA. So thank you to many of you are members of Historic Saranac Lake, supporters of our work. We appreciate your support. If you've had a chance to give a donation to make this talk possible, we thank you for that. It allows us to give a stipend to our speakers and to continue to plan presentations like this. So I think we'll supply a link a little bit later on, and if you'd like to hit that donate now button, we appreciate that. I want to thank the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls for hosting me here today. I found myself on the road this afternoon, and they very graciously gave me their entire conference room. So thank you to the Hyde Collection, and one of the great partners in the museum world that we have. So I want to introduce our speakers today. This is, I already said, about the first of 3 talks. So here in the Adirondacks, we often think about questions of public and private land. Residents of the Adirondacks often debate the pros and cons of the APA. And by stepping back and looking at the Adirondacks from a longer historical perspective, these issues take on new meaning. And I'm so pleased to have the chance to do that today with our 2 speakers. This talk grows out of a recent project supported by Humanities New York, in which Historic Saranac Lake began to consider ways to present history of Native American peoples in the new museum. We were able to meet and speak with John Fadden at the wonderful Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center just down the road from us, Tim Messner, who's an archaeologist at SUNY Potsdam, Jen Crester at the Wild Center, and we also visited with one of our speakers today, Iakonikonriiosta, who is the director of the Adirondack Cultural Center, the Akwesasne Cultural Center. This project has really been a wonderful first step for us in our museum in questioning our own misconceptions and beginning to understand a little bit better the length and the breadth of the history of Native American peoples in the Adirondacks. So I'm happy to introduce today our first speaker, Melissa Otis. Melissa grew up in Elizabethtown. She has a PhD from the University of Toronto and is author of the book Rural Indigenousness, A History of the Iroquoian and Algonquian People of the Adirondacks, and she's the author of 3 peer-reviewed articles as well. Melissa is going to do a brief presentation just talking about some of the aspects of her book, and then we'll have a discussion with Melissa and Iakonikonriiosta, she has a master's in library and information studies. She spent her career as an archivist and an administrator, and she now leads the Akwesasne Cultural Center. So thank you so much for our speakers for joining us today. And I am going to stop talking and share my screen and hand over the reins to Melissa to show a few pictures from her book.
Okay, Sego, good afternoon. I want to thank Amy Catania of the Historic Saranac Lake Museum for organizing this discussion and inviting me to participate. As well, I want to thank Iakonikonriiosta for her help and participation today. I'm very grateful for everybody's willingness to be here. So at this time, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mohawk or Kanyankehaka people. I do this when I give these talks because I believe it's important for us to remember that this place was someone else's homeland and that they still think of it that way. For those of us here living in the Adirondacks, we're occupiers of a Mohawk homeland and the western part of the Adirondacks, Oneida. This afternoon, I'll briefly and broadly cover some history of the Mohawk and Oneida peoples whose homeland is part of today's Adirondack Park. As well, some Algonquian peoples are important to this history, especially the Abenaki or Abenaki. So I'll mention them from time to time, particularly during the 19th century. Next slide, please. The indigenous history of the Adirondacks is, of course, Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee history. By the time of European contact, most of the eastern and largest part of the region was the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk. The western part of the Adirondacks, as I mentioned earlier, is Oneida territory, and the Oswegatchie River was their boundary with the Mohawk. Further west, the Onondagas territory ran along the eastern shore of Lake Ontario, and they would have hunted in the western Adirondacks. In addition to these Iroquoian peoples, and you see that on the map here, it's sort of the yellowy color, are some Algonquian peoples, also called, or at least use the Adirondacks, and occasionally it became home to some folks, some of those Algonquian peoples, and I'll mention that a little bit later. Now, when I say Algonquian, I'm referring to peoples who share a common language root and historic culture. Now, on this map here, it's that sort of buff, whitish color. All those people have that common Algonquian language and historic culture. You also see the Algonquins just north of the St. Lawrence Iroquois. Their territories along the Ottawa River. So as the map here demonstrates, they were proprietors of a very vast territory as well. Prior to European contact and up to the 1620s, the Algonquian-speaking Mohicans territory ranged from the mid to northern parts of the Hudson River, probably up to the southern shore of Lake Champlain. The Mohican were pushed out of the Adirondacks by the Mohawk in the mid-1620s during what is often referred to as the Beaver Wars. So the Mohawks' territory after that stretches to Lake Champlain. And of course, territories expand and contract over time, but just after 1620, we know at least the Mohawk territory went to Lake Champlain. Now today, the Mohican are the Mohicans, and their territories in Wisconsin. In addition, according to their oral history, the Mohegans, whose territory today is in southern Connecticut, previously occupied some of the western side of Lake Champlain prior to European contact. So they too called the Adirondacks home at one time, as did other nearby Algonquian peoples later on. And I'm going to talk about those refugee communities in a bit. Next slide. There's plenty of evidence to demonstrate Native peoples went through the region by way of Adirondack River and lake systems, as well as by land. It's likely both water and land trails were used as a system to travel to and from favorite hunting and fishing encampments, of which there are many, and as artifacts demonstrate, located throughout the region. As well, these transportation systems were used for military, diplomatic, and trade purposes. Most Mohawk and Oneida women remained in their villages while the men and boys traveled to hunt, trap, and fish. However, some women accompanied hunters. Their principal role in the hunt was to process the meat and hides, as well as take care of the camp, maybe even plant a small garden. They usually returned to the village by December. The Iroquois hunters who remained after December returned to their community for the midwinter ceremony, held in late January or early February. After the ceremonies, they re-outfitted for deep snow hunting and trapping. So as you can tell, Iroquoian men probably spent more time in hunting territories than they did in their home villages. In addition to hunting and trapping, Haudenosaunee and Algonquian peoples who labored in the Adirondacks to fish, including ice fishing, we do have textual records to that effect, they mined for resources such as flint and gathered plants. While they were here, they often grew at least corn, we have textual records to that effect, and maybe the other two of the three sisters, squash and beans. So as you can see, the Adirondacks were occupied by Indigenous peoples for months at a time and year round. Next slide, please. The pre-European contact seasonal work and occupation that I just described continued after contact and during the colonial period. Indeed, the landscape of the Adirondacks, for the most part, kept Europeans out of the area, except along Lakes Champlain and Lake George. Despite their own avoidance of the region, European officials, merchants, settlers, and military officers during the colonial period did create labor situations for Iroquoian and Algonquian peoples in the Adirondacks, such as work in the commercial fur trade and participation in military activity. So in addition to their traditional use of the region, Indigenous peoples then use labor here for reasons created by Europeans. Now, it doesn't replace it, it's just layered on top of what they were ordinarily using the region how they occupied the region. Generally, Europeans did not affect the occupation of the Adirondacks by indigenous peoples, except along those perimeters that I just mentioned. However, they did impact Haudenosaunee and Algonquian peoples through the introduction of capitalism, trapping for profit instead of sustainable use. And that impact was huge. It depleted beaver and other fur-bearing animal populations, which created reasons for warfare. Next slide, please. In addition, because European settlers avoided the Adirondacks, the region also became a place of refuge for indigenous peoples beginning in the late 17th century and continued into the 19th century. In particular, Algonquian-speaking peoples from southern New England were fleeing from the violence and displacement brought on by colonization, warfare, and other problems such as epidemics in their own homelands. There were between 5 and 7 examples of these refugee communities that I was able to find. And these include the Palmertown Indian community established around Mount McGregor in northern Saratoga County prior to the 7 Years' War, and perhaps as early as the late 17th century. Its members appear to have been refugees from Connecticut who remained in the Palmerton Mountain Range until Euro-American settlement pushed them out in the 19th century. Other examples include the Podunk Indians located near the Washington and Warren County borders on the east side of Lake George, the Saranac Indians, probably Abenaki, who occupied 2 native communities at the Indian Carry between the Upper Saranac and Stony Creek Pond from the 1600s to as late as the 1850s. 2 communities of possibly Algonquian peoples were discovered when settlers arrived in Elizabethtown, a little town where I grew up, at the turn of the 19th century, so 1700s into the 1800s. And as late as 1858, a survey of Warren County called the Chase Map shows a band of native peoples living on the southwestern shore of 13th Pond. Next slide, please. So after the American Revolution, small groups of indigenous hunters and trappers continued to come to the Adirondacks, especially Mohawk from St. Lawrence River Valley communities of Akwesasne and Ganawage. During this time, there was a lot of animosity and violence occurred between especially Mohawk and American trappers, probably due to the Mohawk siding and fighting with the British during the Revolution as much as competition issues. Many of these encounters led to the murder of 1 or more Mohawk hunters, creating very tense and frontier-like space that kind of often think about more out west, but it actually occurred here in the Adirondacks as well. And as far as I can tell, no one was ever punished for these killings. The majority of this violence occurred in the western part of the region, at least from textual sources that I found, likely because it was the last area to be settled. It was still able to be trapped and that sort of thing. However, it wasn't limited to there, and nor was conflict over trapping and hunting the only reason for this violence. Racism was also a factor. I found several stories of, the murder was definitely due to racism. One in Hague, where the native person was Wampanoag, and last name was Paul, and basically they called it some ruffians wouldn't allow him back out of the water. They sort of forced him into Lake George in November, it's very cold, and wouldn't let him back in, and he drowned. So these things happened in the Adirondacks, and we have to remember that. As well, we have the pictures here. This was Peter Waters, an Akwesasne Mohawk, who was killed. You see in the picture here. It's kind of a long story. If you want to hear more about it, you can ask me during the question period. Next slide, please. So all of this said, there was also cooperation between native peoples and settlers coming into the area. And the Abenaki were especially helpful to the settlers. And I'd say this is when their history starts to become very visible in the region. So despite the dangers, many indigenous peoples continued to move about the land and continued to pursue traditional seasonal activities into the region. It's probably about the 1830s, sometime in there, just kind of all the information starts to dwindle. So as Euro-American settlement into the area slowly grew, contact becomes more frequent. Industrialists eventually come and they bring wage work, which is actually the thing that allows Euro-American settlement into the interior on a year-round basis. It really wasn't until there was wage work that settlement starts to really make an impact on the land. All of this affected the ability of indigenous peoples to successfully hunt and trap in the Adirondacks. This encroachment by settlers onto their ancestral territory impacted the amount and type of animals and plants in the region. This invasion by settlement is known, at least by scholars, as settler colonialism, and did as much damage as imperial colonialism, that being sort of somebody coming from Europe and first infecting everybody with diseases and just hurt, having or better the population, and then militarily taking over people's territories. So once again, Native peoples have to adapt to the situation, this time from settler colonialism. So contact between Indigenous and Euro-American settlers, and that includes, settlers, surveyors, industrialists, scholars such as anthropologists and linguists, and eventually tourists, in the area become more common. So some Mohawk, Oneida, and Abenaki start to work in the area to earn wages. By 1840, many Native peoples living in and around the Adirondacks adapted their labor strategies to incorporate seasonal wage employment. And again, this is sort of layered on top of the work. They're still doing their own traditional work in the Adirondacks as best they can at this point. But now they're kind of layering on these sort of seasonal wage employments. And Akwesasne Mohawk often would come down and work as temporary contractors. They would kind of come together and I guess negotiate some kind of a contract with somebody to work in resource industries and industries such as lumbering, bark peeling for tanning, and on the railroad laying track or in road construction. Next slide, please. Now, tourism proved to be a very attractive industry for local and nearby Indigenous peoples to earn wages, probably because it allowed them to continue using traditional skills, and they got paid pretty well for them, especially when you compared it to non-skilled labor. As well, they were greatly admired for their abilities, and they could incorporate this work into their existing seasonal labor. Men began in Adirondack tourism by guiding sports hunters, and women by making and selling crafts that were modified for the tourist trade. Wilderness tourism came early to the Adirondacks. There's very few places that started before this area, from my research anyways. The first recording of a guided hunting trip in the Adirondacks was by New York City author and editor Charles Fenno Hoffman in the late 1830s. He and a companion hired Captain Gill, identified by Hoffman as Akwesasne Mohawk, to guide them for sightseeing and hunting. As time went on, guiding done in the area was performed by both Indigenous and Euro-American men. Indeed, the latter soon outnumbered Indigenous guides. They sometimes worked together, and eventually some began to intermarry and start families. Next slide, please. Now, as the 19th century wore on, the wilderness holiday of, sort of that the man coming in and hunting for weeks at a time, it starts to cater to the rest of the family, particularly wealthy and upper middle class women and their children. Forms of distraction evolved, which included the making and selling of souvenirs by Native people. There are records as early as 1800 describing a small group of Indigenous people selling baskets at Ballston Spa, which was then Ballstown Spring. Indian encampments sprang up in Saratoga by 1826 and later in Lake George. And there was three. There was two at one time in Saratoga that ran sort of at the same time. There was as many as three there in Saratoga and two in Lake George. Miniature versions of encampments appeared in smaller towns. The larger encampments, though, take on an amusement park-like atmosphere. Native peoples demonstrate the skills of bows and arrow. They give basket making demonstrations, as well as other types of performance in order to entice tourists to these encampments. Of course, the tourists are looking for something to do, and the Native people are hoping they're going to purchase baskets, beadwork, and other souvenirs to earn wages. So for a variety of reasons, the encampments disappear at the beginning of the 1900s, like right around 1901. So it's really, it's right at the turn of the century. However, there were other ways Native people found to sell their souvenirs. They might set up a temporary seasonal shop. They established brick and mortar stores, and they sold their wares at transportation hubs such as railroad stations and steamer docks, to name a few. Next slide, please. And one occupation we often don't think about alongside the history of Native Americans is that of entrepreneur. But it was not that unusual both locally and nationally. They ran retail shops for souvenirs, as I previously mentioned, but also general stores. And one example of that was run by an Oneida man by the name of Thomas Hammond in Warren County. His early 19th century store was so influential, they started calling that part of Queensbury the Oneida, and they still call it that today. And that's kind of how they would refer to his store. But we have to go up to the Oneida to get So, and it's still called that today. In addition to stores, many Native peoples of the Adirondacks ran boarding houses and cabins. They became restaurateurs and produced and marketed products. In Indian Lake, an Oneida and Abenaki woman by the name of Emma Camp Mead turned her family home into a seasonal hotel called the Adirondack House, which she ran off and on until her death in 1934. In addition, Emma started and managed a number of enterprises even before establishing her hotel, including she did have a store. And inside the store, she also had a little hat shop. As well, she had a luncheon place where she also sold baskets. She also boxed and sold herbal remedies for livestock. You see a picture of one of the packaging here. One was called a superior conditioning powder and the other a heath powder. Next slide, please. In the 20th century and up to the present time, Indigenous people still call the Adirondacks home and or continue a relationship with the area. And like all Adirondackers, they had to make adjustments as times changed. Wilderness tourism began to wane after World War I with a variety of reasons, but especially with the advent of the car. Instead of families idling the summer away at resorts all summer long, they began to motor to the Adirondacks for maybe a week or a long weekend to participate in sports such as hiking, skiing, and golfing. Amusements at the Indian encampments were replaced with roadside tourist attractions that catered to children. Starting in the 1950s, some Native families helped develop and perform in Indian villages located at regional tourist attractions, such as Frontier Town in North Hudson, the Indian Village in Lake George, and the Enchanted Forest in Old Forge. Native peoples used their woodcraft and artistic skills, the latter of which they often sold, as well as performance ability to share Indigenous dances and customs to educate the American public who would come to travel there. Some also worked at summer camps for children, teaching woodcraft and artistic skills. In addition, Native peoples also participated in local and state events such as pageants to remind locals and tourists alike that they were part of the region's history and still contributing to it. Next slide. And I like to remind Adirondack audiences that the Mohawk and Oneida have not forgotten about their territory in the Adirondacks. One fairly recent example of this was the takeover of the abandoned Moss Lake Girl Scout camp in 1974 by the Mohawk. Mostly from Ganawage, but some from Akwesasne Mohawk were looking for a place to live a more traditional lifestyle based on Mohawk values than what was occurring on their reserves in the late 20th century. After 3 years, the state of New York, under then Governor Mario Cuomo, exchanged the land in the Adirondacks for the current community of over 600 acres at Minor Lake near Altona in Clinton County, just north of the Blue Line. In addition, both the Oneida and Onondaga included parts of the western region of the Adirondacks in their federal land claims. And of course, the Mohawks still consider the region part of their homeland and territory. A handful of Indigenous families still call the Adirondacks home, and some that are artists and educators are recognized for their efforts by their local communities. We saw in the last slide was the, what's her name? Joyce. It's like the name just went out of my head. But they were very big over in Old Forge. I'll think of it later. But also we have the Mohawk Fadden family here at Onchayota. They often get visitors from Akwesasne, not only to see the Six Nations Museum, but to find out, people will come and ask them where to find plants for medicine, food, and baskets and other resources. So this is where the title of my book, Rural Indigenousness, comes from. It's a way to not only understand the rich and long history of Haudenosaunee and Algonquian peoples who have occupied the Adirondacks long before Europeans arrived, to also understand that they've maintained a relationship with the region for centuries, and they still call it, consider it part of their homeland. Now, I thank you. I can't remember their names.
Thank you, Melissa. That was there was so much in your book that was a very small bit because your book has so much in it. But thank you so much for sharing it. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, I hope that gives you a taste of how much there is to read and learn from the book. So wonderful to hear that presentation. And Iakonikonriiosta, I wanted to welcome you again to the conversation and just give you a chance to say hello to everybody, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your wonderful place and share some thoughts about the book, and we can sort of open it up for discussion. So
Sego Zewagwego Iakonikonriiosta, you get Iakonikonriiosta is my name. It means she makes them have good thoughts, and so I'm hoping that I can live up to that today. I want to thank Amy and Melissa for allowing me to be part of this presentation. And I wanted to thank Jen for showing up, and she said she's going to support me. She's from the Wild Center. I I was really happy to read the book in many ways because it presents a history that isn't very well articulated in any other book that I've read. But of course, then I was also sad to read the book because of the incidences that are recorded in there. One of the things that I did notice, and maybe it's my own ego, was that there was a lot of emphasis on the Algonquin and not so much on the Mohawk. So that was just, I always hear from the Mohawk side of things. So it's like the Algonquins don't even exist to us, at least in the histories that I've heard. So it was really refreshing to hear so much of the Algonquin history is being recorded there. Our little museum here, it doesn't speak much to the Algonquin side of things. And we try to talk to what's going on down here in Akwesasne. One of the things that her book really made me see is that when we go through the border every day, they ask us, where are you coming from, right? And there's a lot of people within the community who will say, don't say Hogansburg or Cornwall Island, say Akwesasne, and don't say Akwesasne, New York, or Akwesasne, Quebec, or Akwesasne, Ontario. And I think her book puts that out there a lot, especially when she identifies that people were recognized as, oh, they're St. Regis Indians, or they're St. Francis Indians, and thereby alienating us from the Adirondacks themselves. There's many people here who teach, and we keep in the forefront of our children's mind, is that our territory is 6 million acres and they call it the Adirondack Park. But of course, we know that many of us go down to Gunnajohalege often, and that trek down there is such a beautiful trek. My family, of course, were iron workers, and so they traveled to the cities. They didn't stay in the Adirondacks. We traveled through it, and luckily, a generation down from me, my children are fervent hikers. They love to go through the Adirondacks and consider it their home. I was brought up in the city. My husband was brought up here in Akwesasne. And so when I would go up into the woods, it was like I was always very aware that people think they own the land. And so they may tell you, you can't walk here, or you can't go there, and you can't pick berries. But when I would go berry picking, especially with my husband, he didn't have any regard for that. And, hey, there's berries over there, let's go get the berries or whatever. He wasn't a hunter, but he really liked trekking through the Adirondacks too. So I really appreciated that. And I had to get over this whole thing from the city, growing up in the city, as to people have these specific pieces of ownership. It's totally different. So now I went home and I told my kids, I said, you guys got to read this book for several reasons. And one is that don't identify yourself as Mohawks from Akwesasne. We're Mohawks from the Adirondacks. This is our territory. Our territory is much bigger. And yeah, we'll use our elbows and push the Algonquins over and the Oneidas over, as joking with them. But I have to say that I've been to the Adirondack experience a couple of times, and there were other natives there for the art festival. And when you were talking about in one little town, there could be 2 or 3 native people set up. When you think of that, I think that as a non-native person, you might think that there was a lot of competition between them. But from what I've experienced in my lifetime, when native people, say even at the state fair, are set up next to each other, it's not competitive. It's very cooperative, and it's we're glad to see them, and we're glad to help each other to survive in whatever atmosphere we're at. So I'm probably talking fast because Melissa talks so fast. So I got to slow down just a little bit, but I'm just really want to say the part of the book that I really found disappointing was the whole marketing part of it, and where Melissa says that that there were Native people who were marketing their goods, and some of them dressed in feathers, and they were kind of looked down on, or it was kind of theatrical for that. And then there were some people who were dressed in white people's things, and they were also looked down on as being acculturated and whatever. Today we just stumbled across a quote by what's his name? I did what you did, Melissa. He's a reggae singer. Who's that famous reggae singer? Anyway, he said people are often hated for being real, and they're loved for being fake. You know what I mean? So to me, that hits the marketing today and yesterday for Native peoples, because when we're real, we're terrorists. When we're fake, then we're actors and salespeople, and we're artists and whatever. You know what I mean? So it's real hard. And from her book, you can see that whichever way you go, you may end up being the loser in the end, right? And it's always about dispossessing us of something. So to me, even here in the community, we're trying to bring in tourism. What is the guiding line, right? Where is the line where you've gone too far? Those kind of discussions are happening all the time. Another discussion that's happening is that we try to partner with people within the Adirondacks, say the Wild Center and the Adirondack Experience, and it's not easy to gain trust. I need to just say that. So we have to work at it, and it's we've gained that trust with the Wild Center and the Adirondacks, but I think that the Adirondack Experience, but it's something that needs to be maintained. It needs to be maintained not only on a yearly basis, but on a monthly basis at least, so that you can feel that you're not just another object to be studied. You're not just someone who can produce goods and get it up there so that they can sell it at a profit, and most likely bigger profit than we would sell it down here. So it's a really complex subject. It's a subject that's close to our heart, and what I would want to put out there is that as a people, people of the Adirondacks, the people in the Adirondacks are no different than we are. They're no better or worse than we are. And we don't expect them to stay the same as the people who were there in the 1700s, and they shouldn't expect us to stay the same either. We have a right to grow and to change, and hopefully we're all the better for it. The other thing I wanted to say is that although she went through the history so fast, my understanding from archaeological and anthropological people is that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy probably started about 1,000 years ago. And it's taken us 1,000 years to develop a very complex social structure and governmental structure that was so democratic in its promise, and developed such a peace among the Confederacy that the United States copied much of our governmental structure to create the United States Congress. Now, I get people coming in here all the time, and I talk to them about it, and I'm not sure what they think about it, but this is what I think about it, is that it took 1,000 years for us to get to a point where despite individual differences, that we could bring forth problems and try to solve them, until of course the non-native got involved in it back when the Revolutionary War started. But the racism, the division of the Democrat and the Republican Party right now is so, it hurts the heart, because our children watch it and it's in our face every day. But the United States is only 250 years old. And what I'm thinking is that it takes crisis and chaos to bring order, right? And so the people have to start realizing, by looking at each other and seeing each other, that the way that we treat each other is wrong. When you come here, I talk about the one dish, one spoon treaty belt that we have. And that is one of the major treaties that we have with other Indigenous people. And we also share that with other peoples that came into our territory. And the basis of it is that you have to share. You have to help each other to get through this life. It's a hard life. And so when you don't share, then you start to fear each other. They're going to take what I have, or I'm going to have to share with them. And I have to create in my mind reasons that I don't have to share, or that I can reap more from them than they reap from themselves. And then you end up with racism. If you have a person that's coming to you and feeding you every day, you have no fear of them, right? Just like a little kid, right? You don't fear somebody who's offering you something, but you fear somebody who's going to take your toys, you know? And to me, that's the Western society. They fear people who are going to take their toys, you know, or take their land or take whatever. They have no qualms about doing that to other people, but they fear that themselves. And I think that's the problem. I'm hoping that our people can have a time where we can bring back to the American public the philosophy of one dish, one spoon, and that some of the solutions of the big divisions in the country will start to go when people start to share more. What do they call that? Justice, right? Environmental justice, food justice, sustaining justice, so that people are seen more equally. And you start to do that, you have justice, then you have peace. Everybody wants peace, and there is no justice, so there is no peace. So anyway, that's enough of my proselytizing. I'm sorry about that. I can't hear you, sorry.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm so glad you shared that. Iakonikonriiosta, that was powerful. It's hard to follow that up with a question. Melissa, do you have a question or a comment? Anything else? Or maybe
I had to unmute myself. No, I appreciate everything that Iakonikonriiosta said. You know, it's really, it's really important that we listen to the Indigenous peoples who have been here for millennia. As she mentioned, we've only been a country for 250 years. You know, and for myself, and I feel like I only scratched the surface, but I did spend a lot of my scholarship learning about particularly Iroquoian and Algonquian people's histories. But it's really, really complicated. It's deep, it's rich, and we don't learn about it in school, in college, and that's a real shame, because we learned so much from just knowing that history. And then, of course, in the present, there's a lot of issues, but we can learn so much from their wisdom and how they were stewards of the land. I mean, that's what the Adirondacks were all it's supposed to be about stewardship of the land. That's why we're a park. And, we could learn so much if we, reached out to, Akwesasne or, and other places to get their input and how they understood the land. And I hope some of my book gives a little bit of some of that, but it scratches the surface only, really, so I thank you for what you said.
You're welcome. And I haven't voiced this before, but it's just the idea that if the United States is still in the birthing stages, I have 10 children. And what I understand is that during the birthing stages, there's a lot of pain, but just before the baby's born, it could be the worst. And it seems like to me, hopefully things don't get much worse than this. And then we enter a period of peace when people are when they finally wake up.
Absolutely.
I want to invite anybody who's watching here to unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you like, and ask a question, or if you'd like to type a question in the chat, feel free to do so, and we can read that out to the speakers we have maybe 10 or 15 more minutes here. So I want to make sure you all feel welcome to do that. It's interesting to be thinking about your book, Melissa, and the things that we've been talking about in the context of the 50th anniversary of the APA. And that is, because it's the anniversary, it's sort of the hot topic that I think a lot of people in the park are talking about this year. Just to kind of frame this discussion with that question, I wonder if either of you would like to share, how you think a longer historical perspective helps you understand, or how do you see the Adirondack Park Agency, which has just been with us for 50 years? It's actually a very short amount of time. How does looking at the history of Indigenous people of the region sort of frame that question of the APA for you?
I think from the book that it gave me a different perspective of things on an economic basis, because I had always hoped that the Adirondack Park Agency was put into place and was there to protect the environment. My understanding is the environment hasn't been that protected in the Adirondacks. That there is a lot of damage that's in the Adirondack, and the book made me think that the Adirondacks, the rules and regulations that go there, and the people that were allowed to live there, was more about protecting it for the elite that lived in the area, and the sportsmen wanted to make sure that there's enough game for them to be able to handle it, and native peoples, or even peoples in the area that used the hunting and the fishing in the area to sustain themselves, were curtailed. And so life had to change because it became a park. And I had always thought it was for the benefit of the earth, and it sounds to me like it was the benefit of a few individuals, and I find that pretty sad.
It also protected the water down in New York City. I think had a lot to do with it, protecting the water systems and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of a secondary purpose, it seems like, and at least at the origin stages of it, of the actual, back to the end of the 19th century type of a thing, not the 50 years thing. Mm-hmm. But I think, again, I would just sort of reiterate, Park Agency, if it truly is wanting to, its goal is to protect the environment of the Adirondacks, they really need to partner with, the Mohawk and maybe the Oneida, whose territory this belongs to. And they did a nice job before we all showed up.
I have to say, I've met a lot of very gentle people that live in the Adirondacks too. People that really appreciate the land that they're living on and that they're trying to take care of. I really appreciate that. I'm not sure of their ceremonies or the way that they approach their creator, but the more that they become in tune with the land, the more that they become in tune with the resources there, the more that they start to see that as part of that dish. I think that the survival of the Adirondacks as a space, as a sacred space, is more secured. So I'm hoping that that's what's happening. I was not aware until we had North Country. I think it was a summit last September. My education and my view of what I see is so narrow when I go through the Adirondacks that I had no idea that there were farmers of color in the Adirondacks, that there were people of color that own property up there. I was shocked at that. So I found that refreshing. And so to me, as more people start to see what's going on there, to start to see that people who are moving in there, not based on color or age or number of people or origins of people, but on how they care for the land, would have the right to live there. you know, not the people who can build the prettiest log cabin or the biggest log cabin, you know what I mean? Or have the nicest kayak, but the people who care for the earth. To me, that would be, if you're going to judge who lives there or who not, it would be on the people who know how to care for the earth.
I guess I would just like to underline, for me, what I think was a really important thread through the book, and I'm not sure I got it so much from the presentation today, but it was just really trying to correct this misconception that the Adirondacks were just a hunting territory. Mm-hmm. I think we have, in the museum world, in other historians, have been guilty of just propagating that myth. And and Melissa's not the first to point it out. You know, there are people that have been raising their hand for some time now saying, that's wrong, that's not true. And it's taken a while for us to hear it. But I remember Kurt Steger came into our museum maybe 10 years ago, and we had this conversation. Kurt probably does not remember this. I hope he doesn't remember it. I remember it because we had this conversation about this, and I said what I thought, what was the story that our museum had been telling, because it was what historians had been saying since Alfred Donaldson. It was just a hunting territory. People just passed through. They really didn't live here. That really wasn't native territory. And he said, you know, that's not right. And I remember thinking, maybe I need to go back and read some different books. So, you know, it's a learning curve. And I just would like to say that, you know, for us, this vision project that we've had is just the very first step. And it's wonderful to be starting to hear about Native people who have worked with through the Wild Center. Jen has put us in touch with some folks who young interns through Potsdam who, you know, are eager to help tell the story that we have been failing to tell. So we're really excited to partner with folks who can help us with that. And, you know, the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center is just down the street and already does that. So we don't see our new museum as a place that needs to really present that history as much as make sure that people understand what a wonderful resource there is right down the street. So.
And I think it is important that because there's dozens of museums throughout the Adirondacks. I literally had to go to dozens of archives, whether museums and libraries and state libraries and national libraries and the whole 9 yards to try and gather all this information. That was part of the problem, is all this information is in all these little places. And so it's just really important to kind of keep refocusing people that away from that myth that there was no history here because it was just a hunting territory. You know, and that kind of gets into, we had that discussion before we came on, where wilderness is a very loaded term. It's a colonial term, because that was just a term that gave originally Europeans and later Euro-Americans, they thought the right to steal this land from people who were already living here. So it's, you know, it's just, that's why in the book I call them wild lands. If there's some place that's sort of, I do a lot of defining and what some of these terms mean, because it's really important when particularly when you look at the history with, you know, Europeans and later Euro-Americans and the indigenous peoples here. I mean, what things mean is so important to define, because we got so used to it from a colonial perspective. Oh, we live in a wilderness, isn't it great? There was a movie that I'm a board member at the Adirondack History Center in Elizabethtown, the Essex County Historical Society Museum. And we were very thrilled to have this man come in and created a movie about hiking in the Adirondacks and stuff like that. Immediately this is maybe 2 years ago, 2-3 years at the most. Immediately starts out, just like you said, this was a wilderness. No, there was no native people here. I was like, I'm sitting up in the balcony going, no. You know, I kind of said something afterwards, but it's just, you know, it's really still very prevalent and so it's really important for every museum to get on board and acknowledge that there's a very long and rich history of particularly Iroquoian peoples in the Adirondacks.
One thing I think it's worth noting is that when I was a tribal historic preservation officer and we dealt with repatriation of human remains and the protection of sacred spaces, there were burial sites that were found close to the Adirondacks. And there was one in particular that they weren't sure the origin of the individual, and the individual was still in the ground, but you could see the top of their skull. And when we showed up to meet to see what was going to happen, there were people from several different nations that gathered there. And maybe to the surprise of the non-native people, there was a conferring amongst us that we did not need to identify that individual specifically, but what we needed to jointly do was to ensure the protection of that individual and make sure that they were not taken out of their burial site, and that we would stand together in that. And so it wasn't something to be fought over; it was something to be cooperative about. And I think that kind of understanding, especially within the Confederacy and with our neighbors, the Mohicans and the Algonquins, is always presented as if there was a lot of animosity. And from what I've experienced, that's not so. And I mean, it may have happened in incidences, but for the most part, a lot of that is totally exaggerated.
That's interesting. I'm just looking to see if anybody has any questions for our speakers. Whoops, that is the wrong button. Sorry. Don't share screen. Hold on. What am I doing? No, hold on. I'm just taking over here accidentally. Stop share. There we go. I was just looking for any questions by anybody. I don't see any questions. So are you just one?
Someone sent me a question, and it was talking about the concept of land ownership, and although she mentions it in the book, the ownership is more of a responsibility to the land, and the responsibility to utilize the land effectively and efficiently was put into the hands of the women, and the women. That concept to non-native people was so hard for men to understand, that women cared for the land, right? And they introduced this whole system of, oh, you have to have title for the land, you can buy and sell the land, concepts that were new to our people, concepts that they used to basically, as she says, they either stole it or they forced our people out of areas. And the idea of belonging to the Adirondacks, even though I sit here daily on the shores of the St. Lawrence, is that I have a bigger concept of the world. I see the at least regional area and maybe the whole North America. I've been all over the world, and it's there is a concept that even though I am standing here on the St. Lawrence, that water that may come out of my faucet will end up down near the South Pole at some point. So anything I do has a reflection on the whole earth, and it's so easy. If I just have responsibility for 3 or 4 acres, well, then I can do what I want with it, and you can't stop me, right? That concept has to change. That one dish, one spoon, it's one earth, one spoon. And the spoon is that you have to tread lightly. You walk softly on the earth. You live simply so others may simply live. There's all kinds of sayings you could have, but it has to come from in here. It has to come from in here. And I have to say that if you feel that way towards the earth will actually feel that way towards you. And we have to learn that, teach our children that. I hope I haven't stifled everybody. There's no questions. I'm just hoping.
No, you're not stifling.
And I don't often, go ahead.
Hi, this has been a really lovely set of presentations and discussion. Thank you so much. Melissa, when I read your book, I was very taken aback by the extent to which the intermarriages were happening within and around northern New York with between the settlers and native peoples that were here, and also the terminology that was put forth for the native individuals that were here as French Canadian Indians, as somebody who was not from here, and having grown up in the Adirondacks and having family from here, I know just from my friends circle that there are a lot of sort of like legendary, oh yeah, my grandmother was French Canadian Indian, my uncle was a French Canadian Indian, and I'm wondering the extent to which, if families have that sort of history, how could they find out more about whether in fact there was some sort of intermarriage and acculturation, so that maybe people can connect better to the native communities that are here and realize, oh, actually we are one people and all here together, as opposed to separate from one another.
Well, certainly, I mean, people, I used a lot of genealogy to do the research for my book. But there's kind of a difference with somebody who's, and I mentioned in the book, somebody who was part Indian versus somebody who's kind of maintained some connection with their Indigenous relatives and on whether on reservation, reserve, or whatever. I mean, there's a little difference, and that's kind of a loaded topic in and of itself these days, as far as, at least from what I understand about Canada and the United States. There's what constitutes being an Indigenous person versus somebody being like, I would say I'm part Irish. Doesn't mean I get to go back to Ireland and be a citizen of Ireland, right? And so that's, again, there's a little bit of issues that go on there, but a lot of it has to do with funding and whatnot. But I remember, she's professor at Cornell. I'm trying to remember what, and I mentioned her, I think, in the book, where she talks about that Iroquoian peoples are like, it's fine to check in and try to find your relatives and that sort of thing, but just remember, some people sit closer to the fire than others do. So and maybe you can talk better to this. Iakonikonriiosta. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over your name. I really tried hard to remember how to say it. You can probably talk better to this than I can, but I just know from some of the, whether it's articles that I've read and and just comments and things like that, it's a little tricky subject as far as trying to reconnect with your relatives. And I think I talk about that in the book. I know there's some one family, they know they're from Tyendinaga, that through it was like a great grandfather type of a thing, but and one woman really would like to get to know her family, and another is like, her sister is like, no, I don't care. So it's really kind of very individualized, and again, you have to be very sensitive to it.
I think that when you come to try to reconnect with your family, there's lots of records down here, especially through the Catholic Church, because so many people were baptized. The thing is that people are leery all the time. It's, why do you want to reconnect? You want to reconnect because you want to know what your clan is, and so that you can avail yourself of medicines, or do you want to reconnect because you want to see if you can get a tax exempt card, or do you want a piece of if there's ever any annuity that's going out? Is that why you want to reconnect, or do you want to buy more land so that you can do what you want on it? I mean, it's a lot of times people who come here to want to be native, they want it for economic gain and or exploitation of that part of them that's Indian, and very few want to come for spiritual reasons, right? So it's you have to check yourself out. Why do you want to come? If you want to come, I think, and you have good motives, doors open. You know what I mean? And so you have to think of why you want it, right? There was a lady that came here and she wanted to know about our creation story. And she wanted to know about the twins in the creation story. And after I talked to her for a while, then finally she said, well, I want to write a book. And then she just talked about what she wanted to do in the book. And she wanted to distort the creation story to write this fantasy that she had. And I was so like, oh my God, you know, you think that because your great-grandmother was Native, that you have the right to take a sacred story and distort it the way you want. And I was holding it all inside. And then finally she says, well, do you know anybody that I can tell that can get that information from? And I said, well, I do. I know a lot of people, but I don't know anybody that would tell you that story, to listen to why you want to tell the story the way you want to tell it without kicking you out the door. And she was just shocked, you know, what do you mean I don't have a right to it? And I was just like, no, you can't turn our creation story into a Disney movie. Sorry. You know what I mean? It's just, so it's intent, right? And so to me, you come with a pure heart. You want to know, you want to figure out how you stand in the universe. How are you related to the sun? How are you related to the moon? How are you related to the cosmos? Come and then learn this story. You know what I mean? And see where your spirit will go when you leave this place. You know, it's about standing. It's about being part of the whole.
I just want to read one comment from one of you. Thank you for this comment. It says, I would encourage visiting the Akwesasne Cultural Center if you haven't been recently. It's a really wonderful place to learn more about the Haudenosaunee culture, and also the Six Nations Indian Museum. Now the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center is reopening to the public on July 1st. So thank you for that, Jen. And I want to mention a correction. I gave your wrong title. Iakonikonriiosta, your title is actually manager of the museum at the Akwesasne Cultural Center. So you, as a manager of a museum, are a very busy person. I know you have lots to do, and you've been with us for a whole hour. So I want to thank you for joining us and let you and Melissa and everyone else get back to your busy lives. But this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for your time. Thank you for permission to record this presentation, because we've had lots of people that are asking for that and interested to see. So it's been a nice way to pass the afternoon.